We will
Keir
build on.
Starmer, a pledge is not an indication. A pledge is a word, is your word. It's a pledge.
Bit collective
It's
action.
not in your pledge.
Well, the pledge is 3 lines, Andrew. You're asking me for more detail and I'm giving it to you.
Keir Starmer completely lost it when Andrew Neil exposed his dirtiest secrets on live TV. From vague housing policies that shamelessly prioritise migrants over struggling locals to his dodgy refusal to disclose his major campaign donors, it was a brutal takedown. Neil didn't hold back, firing question after question with surgical precision. And Starmer? He was utterly stunned, fumbling and stammering like a rookie caught red-handed.
But the fact is, the 2016 Trade Union Act, when it comes to cribbing and curtailing union power, is not the key legislation.
Give me that,
because you're hiding behind the process.
No, the Labour Party
Why
said...
don't you do what the other candidates do and tell... Don't Labour members have a right, as they decide whether to vote for you or not, they want to know where your money's coming from?
I've been asked that many times. I've said it's coming from...
The so-called leader of the Labour Party failed spectacularly to defend himself, proving that his lack of transparency isn't just a bad look, it's a glaring red flag about his credibility. Neil left no stone unturned, dismantling Starmer's excuses and forcing the audience to confront a harsh reality. This man's leadership is built on a foundation of contradictions and empty promises. Watching Starmer crumble under Neil's relentless questioning was a masterclass in exposing political hypocrisy.
Coming from?
I've been asked that many times. I've said it's coming from trade unions, from crowdfunding, from individual donations.
Who's your biggest donor?
It's coming from those 3. One of my biggest donors was put up on the website, I think, yesterday.
Right, that's one of the lawyer.
Yeah.
That's the lawyer.
The man who has spent his entire political career dodging real questions and dishing out pre-rehearsed one-liners finally met someone who wasn't buying the act. Andrew Neil didn't just ask questions. He carved through Starmer's facade like a hot knife through butter, exposing a politician so painfully out of his depth. It's a wonder he didn't call for a lifeline mid-interview.
I've got people from different parts of the party on my campaign working together because I know that simply saying unity isn't enough. Everybody's going to say
That's
that.
not
I've got to
unpalatable. What I'm
model
asking you is a position you're taking that the Corbyn left will find unpalatable.
Well, I'm not particularly interested in finding things that they find palatable.
Let's talk about it. Starmer loves to project this holier-than-thou image, yet when Neil poked the transparency bear, it turned into a full-blown circus. Neil pressed him on why his campaign funding was shrouded in mystery, and what did Starmer do? He went into his classic move, dodging. "Oh, we're following the rules," he mumbled, as though the electorate is supposed to cheer for mediocrity. Here's the kicker, £125,000. That's all he could muster up as declared funds.
But who are your 5 biggest donors?
Well,
you haven't announced. You've only announced about £125,000 worth of donations. This campaign costs a lot more than that, doesn't it? Doesn't transparency just demand? I mean, it's.
Starmer's attempts to down.
You'd think the future leader of a country would have enough donors to at least look credible, but no, Starmer couldn't even manage that. Neil rightly dragged him through the mud, bringing up Lord Ali and challenging him to name the rest of his backers. And Starmer, fidgeting, sweating, stammering, transparency, never heard of it. The audience wasn't just unimpressed, they were laughing.
Principle at stake that Labour Party members who are being asked to vote for you should know who's bankrolling your campaign.
That is why the Labour Party set up those rules.
But you won't tell us.
The Labour Party rules say, carry out the checks, which we have to carry out, and I've got a compliance team doing that. Once you're satisfied the checks are carried out and the donations are proper in order, they go to the parliamentary authorities who put them on the parliamentary website so that everybody can see them. I've been following that procedure. That is exactly the parliamentary rules.
But the other candidates in this contest have published who is bankrolling their campaign.
But wait, it gets better. When the conversation shifted to policies, Starmer's house of cards collapsed faster than a cheap tent in a storm. Remember how he paraded around promising nationalisation? Well, apparently, that's more of a vibe than an actual plan. Neil, being the relentless force he is, asked for details, specific industries, cost breakdowns, the works. And what did Starmer offer? The verbal equivalent of shrugging. It's almost as if he thought the audience wouldn't notice his promises were as empty as his answers. Then came the tuition fees moment, and oh boy, if you weren't cringing by now, this was the cherry on top. Starmer has been parroting Labour's long-standing promise to scrap fees, but when asked if it'd make the manifesto cut, his response was basically, maybe, we'll see. Yes, because that's exactly what students drowning in debt want to hear. Absolute certainty wrapped in uncertainty.
A pledge is a word, is your word. It's a pledge.
I'm not disputing that. I don't have any problem.
So is it a pledge that these industries will be in your manifesto for nationalisation?
Yes, it is. The point I'm making to you is the manifesto will have to have a lot more than that.
Of course, I understand
This is not a manifesto.
That. Well, what
This is
about
a
university
starting
tuition fees then? Will you remain committed to scrapping them in
They're
your first
all
term?
pledges, Andrew. So the answer.
And then we hit the trade union laws debacle. For someone who claims to champion workers, Starmer seemed oddly committed to avoiding the topic of repealing Thatcher-era laws that gutted union power. Neil, as expected, didn't let it slide. He cornered Starmer on his vague promises about reversing the 2016 Trade Union Act and asked the real question, why stop there? What about the older laws? Starmer's response was a masterclass in non-answers, muttering something about looking into it, while effectively saying, I don't have the guts to commit to anything. It was like watching someone trying to sell a car without knowing if it even has an engine.
You pledged that you would strengthen workers' rights
I did.
by repealing the 2016 Trade Union Act. Would you go further and repeal all the union laws passed since Mrs. Thatcher?
Well, I would repeal all of those that inhibit collective action. There's been a lot of provisions since then, most of them in trade.
Well, they
union
nearly
acts,
all
but
do.
not all of them. Well, nearly all of them do. But
So
you'd
would
have
you
to go
repeal them
through.
all?
I'd repeal all of those provisions, whether they're in those acts or other acts, that inhibit collective
It's not
action.
in your...
By the end, the audience wasn't just questioning Starmer's leadership, they were questioning how he even managed to become Labour leader in the first place. This wasn't a minor stumble or a rough interview, this was Starmer being completely exposed as someone who can't handle pressure, can't commit to policies, and can't even fake sincerity convincingly. Neil wasn't conducting an interview, he was hosting a political funeral, and Starmer, he dug his own grave with every stutter, dodge, and non-answer.
University tuition fees being scrapped will be in a Starmer manifesto.
Yes, that's why it's
The
a
next
pledge.
election. Okay. Why then doesn't the Labour left trust you?
Well, I'm asking members to vote for me in this election. We will find out on the 4th of April what the members have decided.
Keir Starmer's interview with Andrew Neil wasn't just a failure, it was a catastrophic implosion. A slow-motion car crash where the driver not only forgot how to steer but also managed to set the car on fire. Neil came prepared as always, and Starmer, well, he showed up with his signature blend of vagueness and contradictions, which, spoiler alert, didn't stand a chance.
Doing the necessary checks on any donations and then passing it to the parliamentary authorities so that they can be published, and I'm following those rules.
But that's process. There's
Well,
a
no,
bigger...
that's not process, that's
well,
the
you're
rules.
following the process, but there's a bigger principle at stake, that Labour Party members who are being asked to vote for you should know who's bankrolling your campaign.
The opening blow. Neil didn't waste a second before calling out the most glaring issue with Starmer's housing policies. Here's the bombshell. 5 out of every 7 homes under Starmer's grand housing plans were allocated to migrants. 5 out of 7. Let that absurdity marinate for a second. Neil laid out the cold, hard stats. And Starmer. He mumbled something about broader strategies and tried to dodge the obvious. Local British families are being completely sidelined. Instead of owning up to this colossal oversight, Starmer performed his signature move, verbal gymnastics. But Neil wasn't having it. He pressed harder, pointing out how this policy directly fueled public frustration, especially among communities that are already struggling to secure affordable housing. Starmer's response? More platitudes and empty rhetoric. It was like watching someone drown in a kiddie pool, tragic and avoidable.
Your pledge doesn't mention any of that.
Well, the pledge is very clearly that I will take whatever is necessary to stand with our trade unions, and I stand by them.
And then there was Gareth Snell, the former Labour MP who clearly didn't get the memo about party loyalty. Snell's critique was a brutal gut punch to Starmer's already shaky credibility. He outright accused Starmer of prioritising Labour's internal approval over securing actual parliamentary seats. Translation: Starmer's too busy kissing up to the party elites to care about what real people want. Neil, of course, ran with this. He drilled Starmer on the glaring disconnect between his policies and the priorities of the very communities Labour claims to represent. Starmer's response? A masterclass in deflection, with a side of fidgeting and stammering. At this point, it was clear to everyone watching that Starmer wasn't dodging these questions because he was unprepared. He was dodging them because he had no answers.
Was a Labour MP for Stoke.
Yeah.
Not anymore. He lost. He says he personally begged you to rethink the referendum policy. But he said he was ignored, in his words, because you thought being popular with the membership was more important to you than holding parliamentary seats. He sees you as a key reason for the defeat in December.
But the real Starmer's painfully hypocritical relationship with Jeremy Corbyn, oh, this was gold. Neil dragged out the receipts, reminding everyone how Starmer once stood shoulder to shoulder with Corbyn, singing his praises and defending his leadership. Fast forward to today, and Starmer's doing everything short of erasing Corbyn from Labour's history books. Not only has he distanced himself, but he's also gone full betrayal mode, openly blaming Corbyn for the party's tarnished reputation. The flip-flop was so blatant, so shameless, that even Neil seemed genuinely baffled by Starmer's audacity. And when Neil pressed for an explanation, Starmer flailed. He tried to justify it as evolving priorities or some nonsense, but anyone with a shred of common sense could see right through it. It wasn't evolution, it was desperation.
Well, Andrew, Gareth has his own view. What I can tell you is that members of Parliament in those seats, Toby Perkins in Chesterfield, Jenny Chapman, who lost her seat in Darlington, Emma Hardy in Hull, are all supporting me in this campaign, and they're all very close to their communities.
But what
so I know what Gareth said.
Right.
But look, one of the things...
Another say that something...
Let me finish, because that's a fair challenge to me. No. So what I've been trying to show in my campaign is that I do have the support and the backing of representatives, MPs, those who were MPs, and councillors and others in the very communities that make up what we're calling...
Here's the thing, Starmer's betrayal of Corbyn isn't just political opportunism. It's the kind of two-faced behaviour that makes voters question if this guy has any core principles at all. Neil exposed this beautifully, pointing out how Starmer's desperate attempts to appease traditional Labour voters while rebranding himself as a fresh leader had backfired spectacularly. Spoiler alert, you can't have it both ways. Starmer's performance didn't just highlight his contradictions, it screamed them from the rooftops. Neil didn't even have to twist the knife. Starmer was busy doing that himself with every incoherent answer.
And we want decisions about us made by us. So I've actually, for the last 3.5 years, had those conversations in those communities, because I know very well that in my constituency we voted heavily for Remain.
Of course.
And that's why I have been to a lot of other places to have those conversations.
Or what's left of the red wall, which isn't much, that the conversations weren't gritty enough because you now want free movement with the European Union to continue.
But the absolute knockout punch? Watching Starmer crumble under Neil's calm, relentless questioning. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was a full-on dissection of Starmer's leadership, or lack thereof. By the end of the interview, the man who aspires to be Prime Minister looked more like a deer caught in headlights, desperately searching for an escape that didn't exist. Neil's precision exposed every crack in Starmer's armour, every half-baked policy, and every hollow promise. This wasn't journalism, it was a public service, showing the world exactly who Keir Starmer really is. A politician with no spine, no answers, and no chance. In the end, what we witnessed wasn't leadership or competence, it was an unfiltered disaster. Starmer wants to lead a nation, yet he couldn't lead himself out of Neil's questions. The man who positions himself as the people's champion was reduced to a fumbling mess, leaving everyone watching with one resounding thought. If he can't survive Andrew Neil, how on earth is he supposed to survive running the country?